an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Well, welcome in. Here we go. It is the 12th day of July, 2023. It's Now and Next. Dave Trafford here for Story Studio Network. Got a lot of reaction yesterday when we did the roundtable. A little longer than normal. But Barb DiGiulio and Kim Geddes were sitting in yesterday, and we got into a variety of issues. Everything from NATO to being tackled at the door of Walmart to check your receipt on the way out to make sure you paid for everything that's in your bag. But Barb was quite intrigued as to why I was no longer on the radio. So if you missed that, go and check it out. It was fun. Also, I want to direct you to Erin's LinkedIn page. She's got a behind-the-scenes newsletter that she published yesterday, and unbeknownst to me, it was about growing up in a media family, and how we got to where we are, and how I got to where I am, and so on. And it was really an interesting perspective because, you carry on in the house, and everybody around you is sort of affected by what you do, and you really don't realize the effect that you've had on them. Okay, well, there you go. Some unvarnished perspectives from Erin in her growing up in a media family behind-the-scenes newsletter on LinkedIn. I'll put the link in the show notes, but if you're on LinkedIn, just search on her. Erin Trafford. There you go. So I have been paralyzed to some degree around all of the conversation that's gone on vis-a-vis media, because I think probably it really kind of crescendoed for us here at Story Studio Network when we attended the Radio Days conference in Toronto. And Ross Davies was the guy who spearheaded the conference, and they bolted it on to Canadian Music Week. And it was a neat idea, and the whole point being, first of all, seeing people face to face, to talk about the industry, to talk about the medium. And the underlying tone of the conversation was primarily, how do we make radio relevant again? When you consider the reach that AM/FM radio has, Canada and the United States, 18 plus adult demo, it's in the high 80%. I mean, they're reaching a lot of people. But as we went through the conference, it became apparent to me, considering the reach that you have, and then subsequently Bell Media deciding that they were going to lay off 1,300 workers and shutter 6 radio stations, sell off 3 more. The question, I think, should have been, why is radio not relevant? What's the problem here? What are we trying to solve? And of course, subsequent to that was Bell's request to be exempt from some of its obligations around local programming, local news. And all of this happened around the same time that Bill C-18 was coming to a head in Ottawa. And the feds deciding that they were going to bang the heads together of all the telecoms and the big tech companies, and that somehow that was going to be the recipe for saving media in Canada, and particularly journalism. And the commentary on all of this has been really stunning from the way it was reported in terms of some of the coverage that this story got. And lots of worries about who's accountable, where's the money coming from, how do you hold big tech and big government to account if they're the ones primarily funding the journalism in this country. So last week, I started doing this show, and it was a Google free search version of the show. I actually went to the source and found, the news in the Toronto Star or a story from the CBC. I actually went to the site and read the news. And in some cases, the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star and the Economist and places like that are behind a paywall. I paid for it because it's of value to me. So on the weekend, I saw the weekly newsletter from Scott White at the conversation. Canada. And he made the point, how very few people in this country actually pay for their news. Whether it's habit or it's just the way the system's set up, there aren't many of us who are doing that. So, and I kind of kicked myself because I realized I make good use of the conversation, and I was just taking it off the website. So I put my money where my mouth was, and I made a donation to the to the conversation. And I consider it doing the least I can do. But it makes the point, this is really interesting. It's an interesting model they have. They have taken a journalistic approach to academic research and commentary on really big think issues. And one of them happened to be Bill C-18, the history of government versus Google and Meta and Facebook. And it's the only site I've gone to yet where they have really explained well the outcome of what happened in Australia. So I thought, let's get Scott on to talk about this. He is the editor-in-chief at The Conversation, but we crossed paths years ago when you were at the Canadian Press, so you know a thing or two about this stuff. How are you?
I'm good, Dave. It's great. It's great to be here, and it's a really important topic to be talking about.
Well, and I think kudos to you and your team, because the number of times I have heard media in this country, and these are people who should be paying attention to it, saying, well, they figured it out in Australia. It's all fine. And I was never convinced that it was fine. And that is to say that Australia was the first country to go to the big tech companies and say there was going to be, payment per link, which is kind of where we are in Canada. And then they morphed that to some degree. And the default position on so much of the reporting and commentary is they figured it out in Australia. But the take I got from your folks at The Conversation is, I'm not sure they got it right in Australia. So I'm certainly not sure we got it right here.
So what happened in Australia is Canada has followed the Australian model, but went sort of one step further. So in Australia, they intended to bring in legislation that would force big tech, and for the purpose of this discussion, let's talk about Google and Meta / Facebook. And they were going to legislate them to do deals with media. And Facebook, in particular, cut news feeds in Australia, and it was a disaster. They ended up cutting out charities, and the ability for them to just decide who was news and who isn't. Weirdly, because the conversation is part of a global network, but the conversation concept started in Australia. So we got cut out. The Conversation Canada got cut out from Facebook because they just took down the conversation.com. So essentially, the lobbyists for big media and big tech started putting pressure on. And essentially what happened, the easiest way to describe it was voluntary deals were made, and legacy media got most of the money, and Facebook and Google weren't required to do anything. So the hammer is there if ever needed, but it's never been needed because everybody's happy. In Canada, my interpretation of what's happened is Ottawa's gone ahead and enacted the legislation, but it's passed the legislation, but it says, well, we're not going to actually start using it for 6 months. So you've got this period now where the dancing is going on, right? And we've seen it that Facebook and Google say that they're not going to carry news. The government has said they're not going to advertise on Facebook. Media says it's not going to advertise on Facebook. Then you saw government saying, well, hold on for a minute. We can have these discussions. We're going to talk about it. Let's see what can work out. And there will more than likely be appeasement to the big tech companies. So they will never be forced to do something they don't want to. And most of the deals will go to the legacy media, many of whom had deals in advance because they were all anticipating that essentially this scenario would happen.
I think that's the challenge here is that, and you use the word, appeasement, and I'm not sure that, that's sort of like a kind of coming to terms where nobody's happy. I mean, they're not unhappy, but nobody really gets, what they should or get or need. And I'm not sure that it's good necessarily for the health and the well-being of the media, and particularly news journalism ecosystem, because at some level, let's just start with part of the plan suggesting that somehow the CRTC is going to be the arbiter and going to decide, whether the conversation fits in as a journalistic organization. And it just doesn't make sense to me. I mean, from my perspective, they have a challenge already understanding the broadcast industry in this country. Never mind journalism. I don't think we want their hands in this at all.
Yeah. So, the weird thing about what you just said, Dave, is true, is because we're in a situation where government really doesn't want to do this. It's not that they don't want to support the industry. They don't want to be deciding who's a journalist and what is journalism. And media doesn't want to get its hands dirty by taking money from government, because there is the perception that will compromise the news. And big tech doesn't want to do this because their number one responsibility is to the shareholders. They're public companies, right? So you have these three partners in this weird dance that, you're right, nobody really wants to do it, but the news industry is in a very, very desperate state. And the question I keep asking is, if not this, then what? Because I don't think most Canadians truly understand that we are on the precipice of a true crisis in this country, that a lot of media may just disappear. And then what happens? And that's a very scary question.
So let me ask you then. Let's take it to that point. So what if it did? I mean, we're at a stage, we're at a crunch point here where, I have said this in the past, and maybe this is why I'm not on the radio, that Bell is in the wrong business. They are not in the business. They're not built to be in radio, television, let alone journalism business. They're just not. They haven't committed to anything. They have eliminated entire legacy newsrooms in this country. They're not prepared to take any of the profit that they make and turn it into supporting journalism or any of its benefits. So maybe it's time for them to get out of that business. Now, I realize at the other end of it, there are, smaller organizations that are going to suffer because they can't promote their material through Google or Facebook, et cetera. But maybe this is the sort of the break in the model that we need, and we're being forced in our sector, particularly journalism, where we haven't been very good at it before, is to be innovative.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And the problem with companies like Bell and Rogers is news is not their core business. At one time, CTV was a news business, right? That's primarily what it was. It was news and entertainment broadcasting. But news was not only a core element, it was a moneymaker, right? It was a profit center. And it's not now. It's the same thing has happened in the newspaper industry. So where do we go from here? So innovation is important, and it's interesting that at Toronto Metropolitan University, there's a really interesting ongoing research project called the Local News Project. And I was just checking this morning because they do almost a report every month. And since 2008, 474 local news operations have closed in 335 communities, but 217 new local news operations have started. So still more closed, but there have been new ones that open. The conversation is one of them. There are hundreds of others. One of the problems with new operations is most of the times they really struggle beyond 3 years. So if they don't make it in the first 3 years, it's very, very hard to do it. On the flip side of that, the legacy media has had trouble, if I can be a little bit crude, is getting off the crack, right? Is that they don't innovate because they are still tied to, in newspapers, it's still clinging to the idea that print advertising is going to help, and then trying to go to online advertising. And as you know, in radio and TV, it's the commercials, right? Well, that's those sources of revenue are drying up, and the amount of money you're getting for each one of those ads is a lot less than it was 5, 10, 20 years ago. So it's really hard to innovate when you're a legacy company. And for new companies, it's hard to build audience, to build brand, and it's a very, very fragmented market. So it's a very challenging time for media. And I, again, just keep coming back to, it's a really scary place in this country, because if there isn't people providing journalistic standards on the news of the day, then that void is filled up with misinformation and disinformation.
Yeah, it was interesting. Somebody had made that point, and in fact, I think it was a U.S. commentary, because they're talking about a similar bill that's, in the legislative process in the United States. And when asked, well, what do you think is going to happen? And it was more of a, well, if there's no news on Facebook and there's no news on Google, what fills that void on those platforms? And that becomes a real kind of scary prospect in many ways, to your point, especially, again, south of the border. I realize we're talking about the C-18, but south of the border, when we're into an election cycle, and we've already seen the problems that they have there with misinformation and disinformation.
Yeah, it's not good for democracy. It really isn't. It's at the same time, there's another annual report that comes out based on academics by the Reuters Institute at Oxford, and it's a massive study. And I'll share it with you, Dave, if you haven't seen it, so you can put it in your show notes. It's really worthwhile for people who are interested to read it. And they break it down in dozens of countries around the world. So in Canada, trust in news media is, I think it's at around 41%. Only 41% trust media. It's actually, interestingly, in English Canada, it's in the 30s. In French Canada, it's higher. And then the report also looks at the worldwide phenomenon of, well, why don't people trust news? Well, one of the reasons is as politicians rail against media, fake news, which isn't really fake news, it's news they don't like, that drives up distrust of media. So we're in this really vicious cycle. So if media gets smaller, the politicians are going to continue to attack the media that remains. People trust it less. And where does it end?
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring up that word trust, because I think that, for the most part, is kind of at the crux of the bigger problem. And I say that because you made the point already about the diminishing ad dollars that are out there. And the legacy media has chased that. They have chased a diminishing dollar. Well, of course you're going to go down the drain on that. And what they have failed to do in the meantime is maintain the relationship with their audience, with their community. And so there are two ways there that the trust breaks down, because you're not reflecting me or my values or my expectations as an audience. And on the other hand, I only see you chasing dollars. So it's easy to say, you're big paid media, it's paid propaganda, and all the nonsense that you hear out there. That reflex is understandable. And I think in some ways, and that's not just the big media, but I mean, I think media in general has done that. That's the mistake that we as a sector have made. In some respects, we've forgotten the audience here, and that's crucial.
And the audience has made its own decision or decisions. So everyone should think about their own media habits. Podcasts, fantastic innovation. As you know, been around actually for a while, but now has exploded. And the beauty of podcasts is you can They can be very narrowly focused. So if I'm only interested in, say, 1960s baseball, I can go and listen to a couple of podcasts. Or if I want to hear just about media and media in the United States, there are several podcasts that I can go to. So I don't have to, in the old days, I would have to listen to a whole radio broadcast, and maybe I was only interested in 5 of the 20 items. Remember when there were 20 items in a
Yeah.
newscast? And but now we decide, the audience decides. So that puts the pressure on media to really understand what's its mission and understand audience behavior, and there are tools to do that. And then essentially you have to make people want to pay for your content,
Hmm.
right? And
Yep.
that's, again, legacy media is struggling with that, right? It's before other people paid for us to have access to media, advertisers paid for it, right? And that's really one of the things that has happened. And subscriptions for newspapers. Um, there's very few in this country who are bringing in enough subscriptions to pay for the journalism. It's just not happening, right? And why is that? Well, because people have gotten used to getting news for free on the internet via Google and Facebook, right? So it's all this thing that just is this one big circle, and it's hurting media. It's hurting media a lot.
Yeah, and I mean, you and I will have been in the newsrooms at the time when the social media platforms really caught on. The whole idea of having a website was something. I guess we better have a website. We didn't know why, but the thought that we were putting our content up there to serve the audience, there was no conversation at that point, at any point, that we were giving it away for free. Google, Facebook recognized that pretty quickly. A lot of people came to those sites because CTV and Canadian Press and everybody was up there on the website. It was valuable because there was community around that. It was valuable because there was an audience built in. There was, a readership built into that community. So for the big companies now to go to Google and Facebook and say, you're stealing our material, you kind of gave it away a long time ago, and you primed the pump and the behavior of that audience, like you say now, where very few people. What was the number you threw out? 11% of Canadians, was that what it was?
Yeah.
Pay for their
Yeah,
news.
and actually, a couple of years ago, it had gone up a little bit, according to the Reuters Institute. But news consumption exploded during the pandemic because guess what? There was a panic. People needed to trust information, so they go to the old forms, the traditional forms, because they know that they can trust the information, right?
Hmm.
If you look at a place like CNN, every time there is a major breaking news thing, their numbers go up because people know it's the old place. They do a good job. They cover it. It's the same on local radio stations. When there's something in newspapers, it's the same thing, right? But when those things aren't happening, I mean, one of the really interesting things is everybody saw their numbers, and then the conversation was the same, just exploded during the first year of the pandemic. And now, for a variety of reasons, we're seeing the numbers go down. One of those is because the way Google plays around with the algorithms. They are de-emphasizing news. Facebook has been de-emphasizing news. I think the Reuters Institute said that only 29% of Canadians get their news via Facebook, and that's down 11% from a year ago. So that's a combination of people probably just, there's this whole other phenomenon called news avoidance because we've had a couple of rough years and people just want to go to the beach and not worry
Yeah,
about things.
exactly.
But but also, um, I believe because the tech companies are de-emphasizing news because of not just C18 and not just because of what's going on in Australia, but this is going to happen in every company, in every country, right? They are going to, everybody's looking, as you mentioned, there's some laws in the US that are doing It's going to happen everywhere. And, you put put yourself in the shoes of Facebook and Google. They don't want to be paying out billions of dollars if they don't need to. So they'll de-emphasize news and say, we don't need to do this.
Yeah. Well, just to your point where you talked about media companies not advertising on Google or Facebook, the hilarious thing was on, Thursday of last week, the Toronto Star started its own thread feed. So,
Yeah.
I think, okay, I get it. But so let me ask you this, because there's a number of clearly C18 is not the solution to the problem. I'm not even sure they understand, based on the framework of C18, what the problem is. Like, what are we exactly trying to solve here with C18? And they didn't start with the right answer on that, so it's become, the effort of the committee to, design a horse and they end up with a camel sort of thing at the end of the day. There are a number of suggestions that have been floated out there, some in front of the Senate committee on that, did the hearings on the bill. And one of the things I think we need to kind of start with is foundationally around the role of the CBC in this country and how it's funded. And there's a suggestion, I think it was posted on the Hub, I think it was Peter Menzies was one of the co-authors, and saying, maybe it's time to take advertising away from the CBC, broadcasting and online, reinforce the funding that the government does have there, because we do need a strong broadcast service in this country, make that content available to other news outlets, similar to the way CP would have operated in the day, except you subscribe to it, but effectively you and I do because we already pay for it. It may not be the entire answer, but in their numbers, it was freeing up $450 million in ad revenue to start with. There are conversations I think we have to have like that around, look at the ecosystem. Let's not look at just the big tech relationship to news providers in the country.
So I'm always skeptical about this idea that if CBC didn't accept advertising, it would magically float to one of the other legacy media. And it's certainly online. I'm absolutely convinced that's not true. And so it's not that suddenly the other places would open up more ad spots. They assume that the ad rates, they'd get better rates for their advertising. And again, this, supply and demand, I just don't think it's going to happen. I'm amazed in this country that people continue to beat up on the CBC when it is the one place on the broadcast side where its core business is providing news. Look, we can all argue with how a news outlet does its job, but CBC in radio, which has no advertising, right? It's already there, and on TV and online. I always, argue or worry about if you diminish the CBC and you're relying more on the private companies to do the job. Well, let's go back to what you said a few minutes ago. They're essentially already cutting that. They want to be released of the regulations that have been diminished over the decades already, right? So you slice the CBC down to that it can barely do the job. Then where do people turn? I reject that as a solution. I just don't see that it will happen.
Yeah, and I'm not suggesting for a second I want to devalue what the CBC does. In fact, I think, the point being that there is important service there. But I think we need to clarify the lens that we're looking at it through, and be bold or courageous about the need to, dare say, break the system and rethink the ecosystem generally. The degree to which, I think we can reform or rejig, reimagine the CBC. At the same time, I would say that Bell not being in the radio, television, journalism business, Rogers and Chorus not being there, actually allows for the smaller players, the mid-sized players to flex their muscle, to have local ownership, local management. We're back to that connection with the community. That's why the CBC does so well, because they get into some of these smaller communities and they are the only voice, right? So, I think there's real value in that. But let's look at the balance and the shape of that system. Now, you and I can, blow smoke all we want here, but this has to happen at a political level. And I'm just not sure that there's courage, or quite confident that there's understanding of what the issue is. Never mind, how do we get to solution?
I just keep coming back to, government does not want, their feet are being held to the fire because of lobbying from especially the legacy media. We need help. You got to do something. And they're saying, okay, well, this thing in Australia doesn't mean we're deciding, who it is. Work it out among yourselves. And I think the important thing is, this is now going to allow Meta and Google to decide who the winners and losers are, right? There's very, very little transparency from a public policy perspective on how those decisions are made. They're not even going to tell us individually how much money each place is going to get on these voluntary things. And even under C18, that's one of the big flaws of C18, is there's a lack of transparency. And guess what? Media, which when it does its job day to day is all about transparency, freedom of information, they don't want to disclose, for quote business reasons, how much money is being directed. And it's terrible. The media should be totally transparent. If we're going to have a serious discussion about government supported media, then everybody needs to be transparent about it, because that's going to build trust. And then there's a whole separate issue, is should media be taking money from places like Google and Meta?
Exactly.
And especially the role that Meta has played in, as we saw from the congressional hearings more than a year ago, essentially actively promoting disinformation and misinformation because it was good for the profits, right? So why, if media is struggling with taking money from government, why are they not struggling more from taking money from big companies like that? This is a question that's not being asked because we're in a moment of panic.
Well, we're in a moment of severe struggle. They're struggling with bigger things than those questions. I think that's the problem, right? And there is no, again, I come back to, what problem are we trying to solve? And I guarantee you that it's not this one right in front of your nose. There's a one that's further down the road, that even if we do try to fix this in the short term with C18, if it doesn't create more problems, it doesn't fix the real problem or the solution. It doesn't get to a solution that we desperately need for journalism and media.
Yeah, it's there's been discussion that this funding could be a transition to a new business model to promoting better journalism. And that would be great if that happens. But you're right, there are people who are just literally looking beyond the hood of the car because they're about to drive off the road. And it's really hard to innovate in when you're in a four-alarm fire. And a lot of the Post Media, Toronto Star's company, the big broadcasters, they're all really struggling, and it will be hard to innovate. The flip side is that the newer places, the smaller places like The Conversation, and there are dozens of them across the country, are probably not going to benefit very much from this funding, and therefore the people who are doing innovation, C18 probably won't help them very much at all.
Mm-hmm. I mentioned your your outreach, your newsletter that lands in my inbox. I know you were looking for a specific number of members, if that's what you want to call them. How did you do in your drive?
Yeah, we did well. We were trying to get 600, and we came in at 617. And the conversation is always will be free. It's as a matter of fact, it's not only free, is that we provide our content free of charge to other news outlets who want to publish it. We get the majority of our funding through membership fees from universities. And we've started to ask the public for some donations, and it's just been very, very warm. It's difficult, to ask people. Everybody,
We journalists aren't good at doing that, right? I mean, we
Yeah.
were never taught to actually look and put a value on what it is we do and go out and ask somebody for money.
Yeah, but it's heartwarming. The money that we brought in was really good, but it's also people take the time to write, and that's we love to hear about that because there are we have a daily newsletter of 25,000 people. There are a core within that thing who read it every day and like what we do, and sometimes we piss them off, and that's okay too, right? Because if you're only reading things you agree with, that's not good. You got to be challenged. And again, I think that builds trust. Media has to do a better job of responding to their audience in many ways they can.
Well, and I kind of gets at the point where, where big and legacy media has fallen down. You have managed to create community. And that is the, as large or as small as that is, what you have described is a committed community of champions who are not only willing to spread the word about the conversation. In some cases, they're willing to cut you a check and say, keep up the good work. There's real value in that. And it is hard work to have to do that. But boy, if there's a lesson for anybody to learn outside in the larger media groups, it's from organizations like you.
Innovation is really hard. And, both of us know so many great people who are still working at the legacy media. They're working harder than they ever had.
Yep.
They're not. A lot of new media like to crap on the legacy media, and both have to survive, right? They have to survive. The established brands are there. They're serving their community. They have to, survive financially. But the new innovators also have to survive because they're creating niches that aren't being met. So all of these things are really important. It's a tough industry, and I just keep coming back to what happens. If C18, I think there will be this dance that comes out, and big media will get some money. How it will actually help them at the end of I don't know, because one of the other things that's going on now is that these legacy companies are really dependent on not just the potential funding from C18, but from tax credits that are through previous legislation. You're then at the whim of the government. And what if the government of the day decides they're going to do away with that, right?
Yeah.
It's very scary. It's very scary.
Yeah. Well, and I go back to one of the points you made about the CBC in terms of available ad dollars, and who knows how many of those ad dollars would go to the legacy media. How much of that money that would come from the Google Meta fund actually go back into hiring reporters? I just, there's no guarantee in there that that's how that money would have to be spent. To your point, the transparency is the issue. So maybe 6 months we sit down and we can sift through the entrails again just to see how all of this landed. Scott White from Conversation Canada, it's really good of you to join us. I know you're taking some leisure time over the summer, but thanks for talking to us today.
Dave, it's an important topic, and it's great to talk to you, and happy to have this conversation anytime. And speaking of the conversation, theconversation.com.
There you go. And, when I was doing the radio show weekends, that was the best source of the really cool interviews we did for about 4 years just on News Talk 1010. So I would encourage you to go to the site. And it's the kind of thing I would encourage you to look at, not just, for your own edification. It's the kind of thing that you want to introduce your kids to, because there's some really cool research and stories and things about the world you live in that I would say second and third thing that comes to mind. Things that never occurred to you. They're not on your radar, but boy, once you dive into it, It's good reading. So theconversation.com, Conversation Canada. All right, that'll do it for us. It is Now and Next for your Wednesday. Tomorrow, it's Feed Drop Thursday here, and we will continue our conversation and highlighting the first show we did at Story Studio Network. It's called The Next Normal, and our panel sitting around trying to sift through the whole idea, whether or not we could build back better. What were the opportunities? And this is 2 years ago. It's really interesting to hear how they have sort of framed it 2 years ago and where we are now when we hear the conversation back. That's tomorrow on Now and Next. And then, of course, Friday will be the Now and Next Friday thread on my Threads feed. And you'll also be able to see it on the Story Studio Network YouTube channel. Until then... Now and Next is produced by Becky Coles. Our production manager is Jamie Nickerson. Audio editors are Mike Trutler and Drew Garner. And our sonic logo designer is Greg McDonald. Our executive producers are Dave and Aaron Trafford.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.